Hey developers, today I'm going to talk to you about the 10 tips for Angular developers. The other day I was talking to my buddy and he was working in a code base that has tons of problems. So we went back and forth and we're talking about what problems was he seeing over and over again, and what are some good practices that Angular developers should have. And I'm an Angular developer as well. I'm also a Vue developer, but I've been working in Angular for a few years. So we came up with this list. So I came up with these 10 tips. So I'm going to go over with you guys today. It's definitely from experience. I really want to hear what you guys think about this. So leave a comment below of what your experience is with Angular. And if you have any of these other tips that I missed, make sure you put it in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys. So before we get too far, let's have a quick word from our sponsor. Let me tell you guys a little bit about MongoDB. So if you're not familiar with it, MongoDB is a document database. It's really scalable, it's flexible. Essentially, MongoDB stores data in these JSON-like documents, and it makes it really easy to make ad hoc queries. You can index, you can aggregate the data pretty easily, and it's 100% free to use. So you can download it and use it on your own server, or you can use something like MongoDB Atlas and have it hosted in the cloud. So I want you guys to click on the link in the description below. You can learn all about MongoDB and download it 100% for free. So just click on that link in the description, and thank you once again to MongoDB. Hey, and if you don't know, my name is Eric. I'm a full stack software developer. I have several years of software development experience, and like I said, I've been working in Angular for a couple of years now, and I've seen these things happen over and over again. So let's get into it. So this can be obvious, but whenever you're working with components in Angular, or really any framework, you should always keep them small and manageable. And when I say small and manageable, if you had to put me on like a number of lines, I would say 100 lines or less, and try to keep an idea of keep it with the single responsibility principle, which means it states that a class should have one and only one reason to change, meaning that class should have only one job. And so, in other words, if you're creating an about component, what should be in it is the about component. And if you have other things, let's say alerts, let's say you need to add a special widget, then you may want to abstract that out to separate classes that you can import in as child components to your parent component, which is the about. So keep that in mind. You'll see in well-structured Angular apps where you look at a component and you look at the HTML for that component, and you'll see like layers and layers of different components. And I really like that because it keeps things succinct and clean. And you have to realize when you're using components in Angular, when you create more components, it's okay to create extra files. That's not a problem. And it's okay if those files are only used in one place. Some people think that, I should only create a component, a child component, if I'm going to be reusing it in several places. No, I create extra components because it just makes the code easier to read and easier to understand and easier to test. And we'll get to testing in a minute. So keep that in mind. This is not a hard and fast rule. It doesn't have to be 100 lines. If you're 101 lines, doesn't mean you did something wrong. If you're maybe even 200 lines or 300 lines in one of your components, doesn't mean necessarily you're wrong. There is some change. You just have to look at the circumstance. But if you can, look at the number of lines in your TypeScript file and also your HTML file, and try to see if there's any way you can break them into smaller components. It definitely will help in the long term, especially when you have people that are maintaining your code in the long term. So for example, here is a HTML from material, the Angular material, which is a pretty popular Angular material library. And this is from their website. So they have a span and they have a doc viewer, and then they have a table of contents. So in this one component, they've kind of broken up these different things to these different parent or subcomponents. Child components, I should say. Let's move on to number 2 is testing. So I think I see this a lot of times with new developers. When you do the ngGenerate command, it creates the spec file for you to use, but you don't have to use that spec file the way it's generated. But usually what it does is when you create the spec file with the generate, it creates a test bed, and the test bed is a great way to test your component if you're looking to test not just the the TypeScript file or the class, but also the template itself. But you don't need to do that in most cases. So in fact, if you look at the official documentation, it says this. It says the Angular testbed facilitates this kind of testing. But in many cases, testing the component class alone without DOM involvement can validate much of the component's behavior in an easier, more obvious way. So don't be afraid to delete out or just create the file, the spec file yourself, delete out the complete testbed, and just pop a describe at the top, and then just test the component itself, the component class itself, and don't worry about the template. In fact, a lot of places, the template will be more tested in end-to-end testing with your end-to-end test runner like Cypress, where you can maybe even have it go into each input and look at different things. So that might be a better way to test the template, and then keep the testing for your component in an easy describe where you're just testing the class itself. And then you can test what's in it, and you can do things like that. For example, here is a describe. This is from the official documentation. So this is the light switch component. They did const component equals new light switch component. And so now you have an instance of the light switch component, and you can then test some of the fields in it, like is on. And you can see like what happens when the component's clicked. And you can kind of see what's happening in there. You can even check the messages that you see. So this would be like a simple case of using it without the testbed. Unsubscribes. This is really easy to overlook. So always unsubscribe for any subscriptions that you create, assuming that you are creating subscriptions, and we'll talk about RxJS later in the future, or streams. But you will eventually, at some point, you'll start creating subscriptions. And then if you do, you want to make sure you unsubscribe them at the bottom at one point, because if you don't unsubscribe it, you can have issues with almost like a memory leak, because you'll be moving from component to component, and that subscription will never end. Don't be afraid to. There's a lot of RxJS ways you can convert like an observable to a promise, and then you won't have to worry about subscribing or unsubscribing. So there's ways of getting away from using observables at all. But if you do, make sure you unsubscribe. There was a talk at NGConf from John Papa, and he talked about a library that Ward Bell created called Subsync. So here's an example of it. You can look at on GitHub and see this code, and you can download this library. And it's a way you can add all your observables to basically this subsync, and then you can unsubscribe them all together at the bottom. So you can see right at the bottom that ng on destroy. This .subs unsubscribe will unsubscribe from all of them, and you can just add them all in. You can add multiple subscriptions at a time and then unsubscribe them all at the bottom, and you can do this throughout your app. So it's just kind of a quick, nice little library you can use. Public and private. So I believe this changed in earlier versions of Angular, but it's a good idea. I've done this too in some of my components. By default, all your fields will be public, but it's good to set some public and some private. But first, if the reason you want to do that, I pulled this out of Stack Overflow comment that I saw. So it's all about encapsulation. So if you're using classes, there's this object-oriented programming idea where we want to encapsulate our data inside the class. So when you have a field or method in your component that you want to encapsulate it, it makes it clear that it shouldn't be accessed from anywhere else. So when you make a private field, it shouldn't be accessed anywhere else, including the template itself. Because if you do, and it should give you an error actually, because the AOC, the way of compiling the code happens, it'll give you an error if you're using a private variable in your template. So it signals the intent for whatever you put in shouldn't be touched from outside the class. And I think it's just good practice to get good at going through your components, setting public on your methods or private on your methods. Private are the only ones that you're going to be using inside that method. Public are the ones you're going to be using, inside your template or elsewhere. And also, if you have linting, assuming that you set up linting in your project, which it automatically does if you create a new project with Angular command, with Angular CLI, but you may want to turn on no unused variables, which is really helpful. That way, when you create some variables and when you start doing refactoring, all your private variables or private methods or private fields will give you an error if they're not used elsewhere in the app. So, or elsewhere in that component itself. So that way you don't forget, I have a bunch of these methods everywhere, or these fields that I don't use anymore. You should probably delete them out. It makes the code cleaner and easier to read. So make sure you put public and private. I've seen definitely a lot of Angular projects where they have nothing and everything's defaulted to public, and I just don't think that's good practice. Angular forms, this can be obvious for anyone that's learned Angular. It's like one of the first things you learn, but you'd be surprised that I've seen a lot of apps that people don't use Angular forms at all. And there's ways you can use template-driven and dynamic forms. And it's really, I've seen, and I've done it before, I've created template-driven forms that have become way overly complicated, and I probably should have used dynamic. So here's kind of an idea of template-driven. So we can put in this hero form equals ng form, but the real reason you want to use Angular forms in general, because it's supported by Angular, so that's the number one reason. But you can do cool things like this. You can check to see if it's been clicked on. You can do error checking and validation, like that name.valid, the name.pristine. You can have different error messages all built in, and you can kind of build your forms dynamically with all the different types of validation that you want, and then pass that around. I've seen really cool things where we've had whole reactive form generators where we've created our forms dynamically and then use that in multiple different components. So there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. This is the tip of the iceberg, but you should be using it. And like I said, I've seen in bad projects where people don't use this at all. They'll use jQuery, but they won't use Angular forms, which is weird. I'm not going to get into this too much, but don't use jQuery if you're using Angular. I mean, there's built-in things inside Angular to access the DOM and do manipulation, and you should probably not use jQuery. If you disagree with that, leave a comment below. Another thing with Angular, there's classes, there's enums. This is whole object-oriented programming world. So classes are really valuable, and enums are helpful when passing to your components. So there's also this idea of like this open-close principle. So objects or entities should be open for extension but closed for modification. This simply means that a class should be easily extendable without modifying the class itself. So I like this pattern for using classes. There's something called classes, and of course there's interfaces. But you can actually replace a lot of your interfaces with classes in some instances, if you like, by doing this. So you can actually have this class where, like, for example, we have a constructor. We pass in data to it. We have some defaults that we can set for it. And then you can use something like this class, as instead of an interface. So you can have some value, some field inside your class that you can instantiate this new class here, example, and then you can pass everything into the constructor. Now, obviously, if you don't pass everything, it can default some values for you. So this is just kind of a really nice pattern you can use. You don't have to use it always. Interfaces are just used I believe they're compiled out. So they're just helpful when you're using VS Code and you want to see when you want to use like the IntelliSense and you want to do the autocomplete of things. But you can use this type of class if you started using it with your interface for things like you can do mocks and testing a little bit easier as well. And of course the default values. You don't have to use this, but it can be used, and it's part of the language. Here's an example of like using an enum. So you have this alert, which is info equals info, success equals success. When you're creating your components, it's really easy to have like 100 different inputs. Like let's say, for example, this is just a header component, but we're passing in an alert to it, this alert. But maybe you wanted to, say, for example, that you needed to change the color of a text, but you wanted to make a width a little bit bigger, and you wanted to add some extra text, and you wanted to make it blink, and you want to do 10 different things. So you might have like 10 different inputs in here. And then you're going to have your HTML. It's going to have a bunch of ng ifs, and it's going to be kind of messy. One good way is you can use an enum. So in this case, like we have an info and success, we pass it in as an input to the header component when we instantiate it. If it doesn't get passed in, it just defaults to alert.info. And then inside our HTML, we have this class right here. And this binds class to alert. And we know alert is passed in, or it's default to info. And that equals info or success. That means on our CSS, we can just do info. And then we can put all our CSS for info in there. So we could put color yellow, we can make the width 20, we can make blah, blah, the blink tag or whatever we want to do. We can change the font size, any of the CSS properties, and then we can kind of make these broad categories under our alerts that we can pass into the input and then style the CSS for it instead of having a million different inputs. So that's maybe one example of using alerts, an enum in an alert example. One is the next example I want to talk about, tip is RxJS. There is just tons of great operators you should check out using RxJS. And of course, if you are coming from a different framework from React or Vue and you've never used like observables or streams, this may be a little bit foreign to you. And I've seen people like completely ignore RxJS because they don't understand it at all. But really, you're going to have to end up using it because one of the ways you want to use your Angular is you probably have to use the HTTP, the built-in HTTP client for Angular. That's usually the way you want to do, AJAX calls and things like that. And that uses observables. And also, of course, if you're using services, things like that, you're going to end up using more and more observables. If you need to get the route, you're using observables. You usually subscribe to it. If you need to get some information, there's tons of different places in the Angular world where you're going to be using observables in RxJS, and you should know these like retry, course pipe, skip, filter. Here's an example right out of the docs for using RxJS. So they're using an AJAX call from RxJS AJAX, and it does a retry 3 on it. So it's retrying up to 3 times, which is really cool that you can do this. And then you can subscribe to it and do next and figure out what you want to do if the data doesn't get returned. So lazy loading. In the official documentations, it says that this should be used in larger apps. I've seen I think Angular, they're getting better with the new Ivy and the new compilers than this new stuff coming out with Angular 9. The bundle sizes are going to get smaller and smaller, but I've noticed definitely they're quite big even out of the box. So I would say if you can start off with your project using lazy loading. So in the official documentation, it says lazy loading helps keep initial bundle size smaller, which in turn helps decrease load times. It's really easy to set up. And if you are kind of new, you may not know this, but it's just a way that instead of eagerly having every single module load as soon as the app loads, you can set it up so it just loads the first module, the first component, the first page that you see, and then it'll load the other ones in the background. Or you can have it every time you go to another page in your app, then it loads at that time. And there's different ways you can lazy load your Angular app, but it's so easy to set up. I would highly recommend it. This is what the routes look like. After you do this, you have to set up like a customer or a module for each single route. Then you can just easily have it when you route to it, go ahead and load. Transclusion. So sometimes this is known as content projection. In Vue and other languages, I've heard of it called as slots. And essentially, when you're building your components, you can do something like this. You have this ng content right here, and you can then have data. So this would be inside your component. So you would have a component, and then inside the component, you can embed like insert data inside your component in between the opening and closing brackets. And then when you do the definition for the component, you just do this ng content, and that'll insert the information in at certain places, and you can actually slot it in different places using the select. This gets a little complicated if you're doing a lot of selects. It's something that you may not want to use, and it may violate the single responsibility principle, because now you're kind of mixing data between your parent component and your child components and the data in between. But it is handy, and you definitely want to use this when you start building more complex components. And finally, NGRX. So this is like your store or state management inside your Angular app. So I would recommend I would recommend to start with services. In most instances, you can do everything you want to do in using services. You can share data between the different components in your app. When your app becomes a lot more complicated, then I would pull NGRX out. If you do, John Papa created a really great NGRX data library, which helps get rid of a lot of the boilerplate. You'll find out when you use NGRX, between all the reducers that you have to create and all the reducers, and I can't remember, like the models and the effects of using NGRX. Anyways, it just becomes like a lot of different files that you need to create it, and if you can use something like NGRX data, that'll make your life a lot easier. So that's all I have. Those were 10 different tips. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions on them. If I missed any, if you have any opinions, leave a comment below. I really appreciate it. Thanks. And by the way, if you had watched all the way to the end, make sure the MongoDB was a great sponsor for me. So make sure you click on that link in the description below and check it out. Thanks. Bye.